In March of 2024, Leighton Flowers and James White debated the meaning of John 6:44. In connection with the debate, Leighton Flowers released a book titled Drawn by Jesus in order to share a longer written response to James White's earlier book, Drawn by the Father, which I recently reviewed on Rev Reads. And as I said in that review, the reason I read and reviewed White's book was in order to be able to review Drawn by Jesus in the context in which it was written as a rebuttal. To be honest, of my perspective, I love a lot of what Leighton Flowers produces in his response to Calvinism. I think his argumentation for the most part is simple and well done with a kind spirit. He works hard to present the views of the Calvinist camp in their own words, and he is excellent at illustrating and applying these theological issues and then connecting them to real life. He does a great job at following the teaching pattern of Jesus himself. That being said, this wasn't my favorite book by Leighton Flowers. I enjoyed both The Potter's Promise and God's Provision for All more. I felt like this book was a collection of really wonderful moments, great paragraphs and arguments scattered throughout. I had a lot of highlights where I felt like Flowers made these sharp, clear points, but I wasn't a big fan of the overall structure of the book, and I would have loved for it to more simply be a really lengthy exegetical commentary on John chapter 6 in comparison to the paper-thin exegesis done in Drawn by the Father. I especially would have loved more writing and commentary on John 12, since this book is titled Drawn by Jesus. So I have this kind of weird feeling where I absolutely loved all these little individual moments of the book, but I didn't care for the overall structure. And if you have a few minutes, I would like to tell you a little bit more about Drawn by Jesus by Leighton Flowers. Welcome to Rev Reads. If you want to discover more books that will help you to understand the gospel, please subscribe to my channel to stay up to date with my latest book review. And I want to encourage you to please like this video, share it with other people to let them know about the books and works of Leighton Flowers. And I want to say a huge thank you to the Buy Me a Coffee members. It is your support that allows me to cover all of the ongoing costs with Rev Reads so I can continue to put out these reviews. And if you have benefited from Rev Reads, I would love for you to consider supporting the channel. At a beginning membership, we're only asking for $3 a month. Now, I could see right from the table of contents, the first thing I looked at after purchasing the book was that this was going to be a little frustrating for me, because you can look and see at that table of contents that at times the book appears to be a little bit of a grab bag, I would say, responding to James White's presuppositions and other attacks he has made against provisionism instead of directly walking through John 6. Chapters 5 through 7 of this book I could have done without. I've read enough from a provisionist perspective covering the Calvinist presuppositions that they bring to the text. And chapters 19 through 23, while I enjoyed several moments in those chapters, I don't feel like they belonged in this book. But my biggest frustration with this book was his consistent use of John 2:24, where we read that Jesus didn't entrust himself to many of those who believed in him because he knew all men. And I think Leighton has the meaning of that verse wrong, and at times you can see where the error is in the fact that he changed the wording of the verse to fit his interpretation. He writes, in other words, they were not true believers and therefore were not entrusted to Christ. That's not what John said. John said that Jesus didn't entrust himself to them. I believe this passage was a simple statement by John that Jesus didn't entrust his ministry to any of the people that were around him, including his believing disciples during his earthly ministry, but Jesus only entrusted himself to the Spirit's leading and the Father's will. These verses aren't saying anything about superficial faith. This is really a commentary almost on what happens with Peter when Peter tells Jesus, God forbid that you would die on the cross. Jesus didn't entrust himself to Peter's will, but called Peter Satan for opposing the word of God. So these verses aren't about us being entrusted to Jesus, but it is about Jesus not entrusting specifically his earthly ministry to those who believed in him or followed him. Okay, well, I'm through with the negatives on this book. Now let's get to the positives because there's a bunch to cover. The best part of Drawn by Jesus is Leighton Flowers putting John chapter 6 in its historical context. That the Father was drawing Israel to the Son through the teaching of the law and the prophets for generations, even before the coming of Jesus. And that today, ever since the resurrection, Jesus draws people through the church's proclamation of the gospel of grace. And seeing that clear change that has occurred, which nobody can deny, or nobody should deny, and how that change in the way that Jesus draws the nation in the church age in comparison to how the Father drew Israel is a huge interpretive key. And also Flowers' wise emphasis of the crucial role played by John 6:45, that those who are drawn by the Father are those who heard and learned from him. The Father isn't unconditionally picking random people to draw, but he is drawing from the chosen nation of Israel through the clear means of his law and prophets, those people who are humbling themselves and learning from him. And then those people are given to Jesus. It was great stuff. And if anyone is confused about John chapter 6, his writing in this book helps explain to you how you should understand what Jesus was teaching in that particular moment in history. And I also loved his writing on how it is simply, I will call it in my own words, lazy and biased exegesis to hold to a presupposition that those in the crowd were blind as a result of a divine decree given before they were ever born, instead of being blinded as a result of their own rebellion and then placed under God's judgment. I always loved when Flowers would get into the impacts of Adam's fall on mankind, because my view on Adam's fall is right in line with him, and I believe we're both in the minority view overall in the church today, so it's welcome and refreshing to be like, I'm not alone in this. And then you had his teachings on Revelation chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, related to the errant Calvinistic doctrine of total depravity being a corpse-like inability. Really good stuff there. In chapter 16, when he wrote on ever seeing but not perceiving, that was an excellent treatment of the meaning of John 6:36, and that the presentation of evidence, personal experience, having the drawing of the Father right in front of someone does not guarantee that people will perceive the truth and believe. Flowers is right to point out that God blinds people in judgment after he's done all of that to draw them, and then they reject him. People are not born in a condition of blindness and unable to comprehend the gospel as a result of a judgment from Adam's sin. And one of his final points was on how Calvinists respond to the claim that's brought to them that there are inconsistencies with their teaching. And what he talks about there in relation to inconsistencies in Calvinism, that should be very helpful for a lot of non-Calvinists in their one-on-one conversations with the Reformed whenever those inconsistencies in Reformed theology are brought to light. Now, I could go on and on with great exegetical points and wise arguments that Flowers makes in this debate against Calvinism. Specifically the book that was written by James White called Drawn by the Father. But you really should read this book for yourself, and I do think that in Flowers' defense, part of the reason that the book did need to be structured in the way that it was because how James White, when he wrote Drawn by the Father, he used so many unsubstantiated claims based on presuppositions not found in John chapter 6, and I think Flowers needed to confront some of those presuppositions, which is why it then led him away from John 6 at times. I just find it hard to believe that someone could read these two books, Drawn by the Father, Drawn by Jesus, side by side, and come to the conclusion that James White presents stronger arguments. I believe that Flowers' view of John chapter 6 better aligns with how we are told to present the gospel to unbelievers in the rest of the Gospel of John, in the book of Acts, and the epistles. Flowers' view on John 6 also better accords with the purpose of the law and the prophets in the Old Testament. Flowers' instruction allows the teachings of Jesus to stand on their own without the need for so many presuppositions to be brought in from outside the passage. In the end, Drawn by Jesus is a book that I enjoyed overall. It was a really good rebuttal to what came before, but I would have structured it a little differently, and I would have erased the stuff from John chapter 2, verses 23 to 24.